EFF leader Julius Malema has been found to have committed hate speech by a court. It's an important ruling with immediate political consequences, but let's take a step back. This isn't just about one man or one party. Here's what no one's telling you. This case carries profound consequences for how we understand hate speech, racism, the EFF's future, and even the boundaries of freedom of expression in South Africa. And it's far from over. Stick around, we're diving deep into why this matters, and also paying tribute to journalist Tshidi Madia. Spread the fire. Welcome back to the Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh experience, or SMWX. Please help us get to 300,000 subscribers. We are nearly there, fam. The milestone is nearly there. It's great to have you on board again. Now, before I start this episode, I just want to pay tribute to a fine and fearless journalist and a very kind-hearted person, none other than Tshidi Madia, who sadly passed away this week after a short illness. Tshidi made a name for herself as someone who was able to understand the South African political landscape, hold all players accountable while keeping her audience entertained. And she was a great supporter of this channel, I'll have you know. She would often send me messages about the interviews she had watched. And I remember one time in particular, when I was facing some unfair criticism on social media, she sent me a message just to check in with me and reassure me that, I needed to ignore the noise. She was a really wonderful person, and to pay tribute to her, I thought we would play you some of the moments which she shared on this channel. She was one of our first ever guests in, I think, the third ever interview episode of SMWX. So let us enjoy some of the moments that Tshidi shared on this platform, which she helped support.
I often think, and this is maybe a little bit of criticism for the podcast, is sometimes I need a little bit more of a robust engagement. I got that tonight without question, so I'm really happy about that. And I think it's necessary conversations that were had this evening, and I hope that you have more frequently, not just about growing the audience, but just the value of the engagement. I think we keep saying that South Africans need to get involved. You can't do that if you're not talking to each other about what is going on. So it also brings it down to a different crowd. I know that a lot of people have an issue with mainstream media. So I also think that the fact that people feel like they can approach you guys is fantastic.
It's a really sad day for the South African media landscape. Tshidi was a real one. Tshidi, rest in peace. Lala ngoxolo. And our deepest sympathies and solidarities with Tshidi's family and friends at this time. Okay, so in typical South African fashion, we have had a very groundbreaking and seismic judgment which is going to affect the South African political landscape. Groundbreaking in the sense that it is going to have consequences. And today I want to explore this judgment, which has found Julius Malema foul of South Africa's hate speech laws. And really what I want to do with this episode is just give you a deeper understanding of what happened in this judgment and where things might go from here. So what I'll do is first paint the context, because we need to understand and remind ourselves where this judgment comes from, particularly the Brackenfell high school situation, where there were EFF protests, EFF members were violently assaulted, EFF held a counter-protest, another person was assaulted at the counter-protest. So there was a lot going on. I'm going to give you that context and also the context for this case, because Julius Malema made comments about it 2 years later. So second, I then want to look at the relevant law around hate speech. And then third, I'll look at this judgment and its reasoning and its consequences. And of course, things don't end here, because the EFF has already announced an intention to appeal, so this battle will go on, potentially even all the way to the Constitutional Court. So let's get started with the background and the context, because it's actually a really interesting story that we need to refresh our memories on. Now, there was a dispute at a Cape Town high school, Brackenfell High, around a matric dance where there was a kind of breakaway matric dance organized, and it was alleged that that breakaway was only for white students. It was created by parents. They disputed this. In any case, it led to tension around the school, and the EFF eventually went to the school to protest what they assumed to be a racist incident, or what they took to be a racist incident. Now, at that protest, some very violent, very wrong, potentially racist things were done to the EFF protesters. I think potentially racist is even the wrong way to put it. In my book, there was racism involved. So this was no bed of roses, and I want you to have a look at what happened to one of the EFF protesters, which was extremely unjust. And just a warning, the clips that I'm going to play to give you this context contain some violence, so please be warned of that.
Die EFF gaan nie kom in moeilikheid maak in Brackenfell nie. Klaar. Ons almal is hier om die skool te beskerm.
Are you here to hit me now? What is this? Are you here to hit me now? Are you here to hit? What are you here for? You here to hit? What do you want to do? We want to stop us. What do you want to do?
So the person you saw speaking in the beginning of that clip and also involved in that violent altercation was a certain Dante van Wyk, and he's going to be very important going forward because he's actually one of the complainants in this court matter. So as you can see, you may agree or disagree with the EFF protesting, but to react in this violent way, threaten and intimidate and assault the EFF protesters was completely wrong and unjust. But if you, for some bizarre reason, think that was legitimate and justified, look what happened later on in the day where people were hit in the back with baseball bats by these makeshift vigilante defenders of the school.
Don't touch me.
Look, I'm going to stop it there, but this country of ours and the racism and the violence and yeah, so unconscionable, unforgivable, and really just despicable conduct. No matter what you feel about the protest, which, by the way, protest is constitutionally guaranteed in South Africa in any case. And by the way, after this, the EFF announced it was going to have a new protest, a much bigger protest, because this broke out into a national furor. And the school and I believe the education department tried to stop the protest at court, and they lost that. The EFF won that case, and they were allowed to protest. Judge Desai of the Western Cape bench at the time saying that, protest was constitutionally guaranteed. And the EFF did protest. And on the 20th of November, I believe, they held their protest. They held a rally in the area. But then this happened. A white man came to the protest, not exactly clear from the footage what he was doing there, but he also was assaulted at the protest. Have a look at this. This was the subsequent protest which the EFF was allowed to have after the court ruled it was constitutionally permissible.
If in 1 hour these police are useless, they're not bringing our parrot back, who's this one now? What is the problem? What is the fucking problem? Come to the move! Piece of shit! Move! 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 Fighters! Fighters! I'm up in Mpofu! Fighters! 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 I tell about you! I'm up in Mpofu!
So, as you can see, that too was unacceptable, and of course that person, the police dispersed and they were able to make their way out. But let's just say this Brackenfell High School situation, for those who weren't able to follow the translation, Bambum Teto means basically hold the law or keep order. So Marshal Dlamini, the EFF SG there, was trying to stop the crowd. But nonetheless, those were the events that ensued. So this has been an extremely charged matter, one which has excited great passions, and one which has invoked racial tension in South Africa in multiple ways and across multiple layers. Now, all of that was around 2020. Let's fast forward 2 years later, because the remarks for which Julius Malema has now been held accountable for hate speech by the Western Cape, or by the Equality Court rather, came at a rally 2 years later where he was reflecting on what happened in Brackenfell. So take a look at what he said, and we're going to play the relevant portion of the speech which was actually reflected on in great detail by the court.
Why have you not attracted those victims of racism? Why are the victims of racism not attracted to you? Do you exist in paper, or do you exist amongst our people? And do you help these victims of racism to confront racism and nip it on the bud and make sure that racism is confronted here in the Western Cape? You went to a school here to protest the other time, and you were beaten by white people. And there is a white man who's visible on camera. If I were to ask you, what have you done in terms of follow-up after being beaten by that white guy? Why have you not, as a revolutionary organization, followed up on that guy, him alone, to check that guy in an isolated space and attend to the guy properly?
So let's stop there, because firstly, the judge is going to pick up on that statement and suggest that it's linked to an attempt to particularly single this person out and potentially incite some form of violence against at least this specific person. The person who's referred to here clearly seems to be Dante van Staden, who was that person that you saw earlier in the video with the black and grey top. So those comments, firstly, the court found issue with, but we're going to get into it in more detail. But it gets deeper, so let's watch the next part.
What type of revolutionaries get beaten and they don't have a follow-up? And then they pride themselves of being beaten, and they repeat videos of themselves being beaten, and we must vote for them because they were beaten by a white man that they've never followed up on the same white man that has beaten them up. Tell that white man to try me. I'll come many times here in Western Cape appearing a court case, because no white man is going to beat me up and call myself a revolutionary the following day.
Okay, so here Malema is effectively explaining further why he is saying that this person needs to be followed up on. And bear in mind that earlier he had said the organization, a revolutionary organization, would follow up on that guy, him alone, to check that guy in an isolated space and attend to that guy properly. So up until this point, clearly for this individual, they would have a concern about violence being called upon on them. But this next part is clearly where things take a deeper turn, and where the court eventually finds that this is now veering into hate speech. So let's look at this part.
You must never be scared to kill. A revolution demands that at some point there must be killing, because the killing is part of a revolutionary act.
Yeah, so that part is very difficult to defend. Bear in mind, even on matters like the Dubulipunu struggle chant, I've defended freedom of expression because I believe that in the context of a society where you've had a deep history of oppression, especially of black people, they should be allowed to fully express themselves on matters of racial justice in as wide a possible way, particularly when in the context of songs and art that is clearly located in the context of that expression, and that comes from a particular context. But here we don't necessarily have a struggle song, so that argument about imagery and the history of the song, it falls away. And here we just have language that says, following, bear in mind, right after the language related to what happened at Brackenfell, you must never be scared to kill. A revolution demands that at some point there must be killing, because the killing is part of a revolutionary act. Now it carries on, and Malema then contextualizes this by invoking Nelson Mandela and explaining why Mandela took up the violent struggle with Mkhonto weSizwe, but of course that's a very different context to the Brackenfell High School situation. So otherwise this video is going to be very long. I'm not going to play the entire speech, but the rest of that section carries on with the Mandela analogy, and it invokes the EFF's founding manifesto, and effectively says that EFF members mustn't be cowards, and the EFF it must be known that the EFF is not a playground for racists. Then there's a third section which the court cites, where Malema says, I'm not asking you to do what I've not myself, I put that in brackets, done. When a racist confronted me at Winnie Mandela's funeral, I did what I was expected to do because I was not scared of a white man. He then admonished the crowd again, the EFF crowd, saying, you get beaten by white people here and you call yourself an organization of Fanon. Racism is violence, and violence can only be ended by violence, not any other necessary means. It must be confronted by how it is. You are a racist, therefore you are a violent person, and you shall be treated as such. And he continues on that for the rest of the section. So here, he's making the argument that racism is inherently violent, and therefore it needs to be met with violence. Now that, on its own, is an interesting philosophical debate, and there are thinkers like Frantz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth, many other works that talk about the violence of colonialism, of racism, of white supremacy, etc. But the problem is the previous paragraph, where he's now used the term, you must never be scared to kill, a revolution demands that at some point there must be killing, in the context of the previous paragraph talking about when people went to the school, they were beaten by white people, and there was a visible white person on camera, and EFF members did nothing about him. So it's an interesting question in a number of senses. But before I give my view, largely what I want to do in this video is just give you a sense of what the court said, so you have an understanding of what happened, and we can analyze it from there. Now, interestingly, what happened from there is that the South African Human Rights Commission actually said to Malema they think this is hate speech, and they asked him to apologize for it and to retract his comments. And so effectively what they were trying to do was they were trying to resolve this matter outside of litigation, start with some kind of mediated process. And effectively, I think mediation ensued, but then it collapsed and it went to litigation. So the South African Human Rights Commission actually became a complainant, saying that we've tried to resolve this. So they actually brought this to court along with Dante van Wyk, the person who appeared to commit those acts of aggression. Now, interestingly, Dante van Wyk went to court So the assault on the EFF members went to court. One person pled guilty and was given a fine, and Dante van Wyk was acquitted. Now, I haven't read the judgment because it's not reported, but I'd really like to see that judgment, because van Wyk very clearly does punch this EFF protester, and certainly does not look in a very peaceful frame of mind. But nevertheless, I'm not aware that that judgment was appealed or reviewed, but I'd very much like to see what reasoning was relied on. Anyway, so Van Wyk, grey and black t-shirt person from the beginning, he's the second complainant, because he is effectively saying these comments mean that effectively Julius Malema is saying that people need to find me, isolate me, and harm me. And he's saying further that to say you must never be scared to kill, after saying that further, could even subject him to the worst form of violence possible. So Van Wyk and the Human Rights Commission, because these two different things are happening at once, have this kind of combined case before the Equality Court. And this is what the judgment was about. So the EFF countered by saying, particularly in terms of the Human Rights Commission, they should have given Malema a hearing. So they just sent this letter saying, please apologize for these remarks. Whereas they should have said, we have these remarks, can you respond and explain them to us? So they had a procedural problem with the Human Rights Commission. And they also then further went on to say that these remarks should have been seen in context of the EFF's ideology, South Africa's history of racial injustice, racial violence, racial oppression, etc. So that's everything. That's a bit of background. If you want deeper background, obviously go and read the judgment, but that's how I can summarize it for you. So let's have a look now at what the law says about this. Ready to take your podcast to the next level? At Ayeye Studios, you can film, edit, and release your podcast all in one place. From crisp visuals to clean sound, we've got you covered, and you can even distribute your podcast on YouTube and other platforms. The best part? It's brought to you by the same team that brings you SMWX quality. Are you ready to take your podcast to the next level? Welcome to Ayeye Studios. Okay, so in terms of South African law, the relevant legislation here is the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, the PEPUDA. And effectively, in order to have committed hate speech, under Section 10 of this act, which is a key section, a couple of things have to be true. The speech has to be classified as hate speech because you referred to speech, or the speech referred to one or more of the prohibited grounds for discrimination, just a fancy way of saying, and they list the grounds in the act. If you spoke about someone's race, their gender, their religious affiliation, sexual orientation, etc. So it first has to be against one of the prohibited grounds, which is prohibited identity grounds. But more importantly, it must contain an expression which, quote, could reasonably be construed to demonstrate a clear intention to be harmful or to incite harm, and to promote or propagate hatred. Now, of course, we would then need to figure out what is meant here, especially by the question of harm and what it means to be harmful, because, of course, there needs to be a certain level of harm. Because on the other hand, we need to weigh this up against the Section 16 freedom of expression rights and some of the case law around that, which has said that freedom of expression is important in South Africa, and also even if something shocks or it disturbs, that's not necessarily hate speech, particularly given South Africa's historical context. So the Islamic unity judgment really locates freedom of expression within South Africa's history of violent racial dispossession and oppression. So we've got that on the scale, but on the other side of the scale, you can't incite harm or racial hatred. So what do we mean by harm? And here there are a couple of cases worth considering. There's the Qwelane case, which is really the central case around hate speech in South Africa. It's a case which relates to a journalist who was referring to members of the LGBTQI plus community in derogatory ways, and found to have fallen foul of the act. But effectively, you'll notice that your speech veers into hate speech when direct harmful conduct or incitement to harm or hatred or the propagation of hatred comes in. So there must be some objective potential threat of serious harm. Now, importantly, that harm doesn't actually have to eventuate. In other words, no one actually has to be assaulted or hurt or harmed or killed because of what you said, but the possibility of that happening must appear to a reasonable observer. So when it can be reasonably construed that someone might be harmed by what you said, or someone would be harmed, or not would, but could be harmed. It's actually not would, but could be harmed by the speech. That's when the test for hate speech starts to be met. And you'll see from that with Malema's remarks, the court is starting to link the identification of this person, the fact that they need to be put in an isolated place and dealt with accordingly. Let me get the exact wording. It is to check that guy in an isolated space and attend to the guy properly. You've got that mixed with the you must never be scared to kill, and a revolution demands that at some point there must be killing. So the court is looking at that against the law on hate speech and saying harm or serious harm here is in the equation. Now, was this person actually harmed? Actually, no, they weren't harmed. And this was 2 years after the event. But as I say, the legal test is not whether harm actually happened, it's whether it could happen based on the speech. And would a reasonable observer think that it could happen? So that's what you've got to bear in mind in the legal context of this case. Furthermore, we have another judgment, which is Masuku, the Masuku case. And here, really, Masuku spoke about, again, the invocation of language that was violent in nature or could be construed as violent in its intent. So really, it's in some ways the hate speech test revolves around, could this speech be construed by a reasonable observer to lead to serious harm to a person or a group based on their identity? And then the other aspect is, does it propagate hatred against a group? So that's really the law on this situation, or a whistle-stop tour around the law. Of course, it's a lot more complex than that, but that'll give you a grounding. So now you can see that in terms of South African hate speech law, we can have one debate about what is hate speech in the abstract philosophically, but of course in courts of law, there's a very specific test about harm and whether this veers into the propagation of hatred and could reasonably be construed to bring about harm. And that is a very different and very specific test. And that's why in this instance, the court found against Julius Malema. And we can discuss and debate later how strong that finding is. But let me continue with the backdrop and what actually happened. So let's then go, now that we've set the legal basis, to the reasoning of the court. A couple of things. You can't appeal a judgment based on the judgment finding something that's like not factual, but just in the early context. But I did notice a couple of things in this judgment. First is that at paragraph 32, the judge says, although it has been proposed that hate speech should be criminalized in South Africa, a draft bill to this effect was prepared in 2016 but has not been passed. That's just wrong. The draft bill has been passed, and it's now an act. And so that's just wrong. But obviously you can't just appeal a judgment because in obiter dicto, in other words, in passing remarks, a judge made a factual error. But there is now the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Act, 2023. So it's been around for a while. So the judge didn't seem to be aware of that. As well, the judge also waded into trying to explain what Marxism is and just said things that just are not true. Paragraph 78. He's talking about the context of the remarks, and he says the EFF is this Marxist-Leninist ideology, and he says that it is trite that Marxism is propounded by Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, and which postulates a revolution whereby the working class, okay, so far we're right, overthrows the capitalist state, okay, and substitutes it with a one-party communist state, which controls the means of production and the economy. That's not what Marx says at all. He doesn't advocate for a one-party communist state. Lenin advocates for a vanguard state, a vanguard party, rather. And you could say a one-party state, but that's already an extension of Marx. But anyway, this is not a lecture on Marxist philosophy, but I don't think the judge quite captured Marx accurately. Anyway, let's get on to the actual reasoning and the relevant reasoning of the case. Now, this comes at around from paragraph 91 onwards. And this is where the judge turns to those relevant passages or paragraphs in the speech, the ones I've dealt with. And first, there's this exercise in trying to determine, well, is this person who brought the complaint, Dante van Wyk, is he the person who's being referred to? And there's quite a long excursus, etc. And effectively, it is determined that either he or the group that he was with on that day were the persons being referred to in portions of the speech. Now, the judge then continues to say in paragraph 102, in his opening remarks, Malema pointed out that the EFF people there on the day were beaten by white people and asked them what they had done to follow up on the, quote, white man who was visible on the video. He remonstrated, says the judge, with his audience for not having attended to the white man and asked why they had not taken him to an isolated space and attended to him. Malema first and continued reference to those who were responsible for this act, which was to be avenged, was to white persons. So the judge is trying to say, based on the Equality Act, that he's directing these remarks specifically to white people. And he then goes on this thing and says that, well, clearly from the video evidence, there were also colored people there, so it was only white people who were being called out on the speech. But for me, that's really neither here or there. Just because colored people happen to be on the scene, maybe even standing with the group of white people, doesn't mean that there wasn't racism happening or that it wouldn't be justified to talk about the white people who perpetrated the act. So that's neither here nor there, to be honest, for me. But moreover, in paragraph 113, and I think this is the paragraph on which the judgment really turns, he says, to call someone racist in South Africa is, given our racially oppressive past, inevitably to invoke detestation, enmity, ill will, and malevolence against such a person. I'm not so sure about that, to be honest, especially if they have actually perpetrated a racist act. There's this idea that just calling someone racist is the worst thing one can do. And, if it's a false accusation, that's bad. But especially if they've been involved in harming other people in ways that could conceivably be construed as racist, doesn't automatically amount to hate speech. So again, I don't think that's neither here nor there. But here's where the judgment does turn, and he says, this is Justice Scher of the Western Cape Division. So now Scher J carries on and he says, whilst calling out someone who behaves as a racist may be acceptable, so he's effectively accepting the point that I've just made, calling for them to be killed is not. And calling for someone to be killed because they are a racist who has acted violently is an act of vigilantism and an incitement of the most extreme form of harm possible. He continues, this is Scher J, it is not acceptable in our society which, in terms of the notable aims set out, etc., of the Equality Act, social cohesion, etc. And he continues, when such a call, this is a call to kill a person who has themselves been racist or performed racial violence, when such a call emanates from the leader of the then third, in brackets now fourth. Why is this judge being spicy now? What's this? From third, now fourth, largest political party in the country. It has the potential to foment racial violence on a large scale. Now, I think the judge makes a good point there in drawing this distinction between, okay, there's nothing wrong necessarily with calling someone racist who's performed a racist act. In fact, that's the right thing to do, by the way, because it would be true. But that doesn't justify taking the matter to the furthest extreme and calling for violence to be meted out against them, much less introducing language about killing, etc. And that's where I think, given the legal framework, we can have a philosophical debate later. This is going to be a very difficult case for the EFF and for Julius Malema, in particular, given the backdrop of the act. However, to then make the jump that this would foment racial violence on a large scale, I'm not sure if that extreme conclusion is justified either. But effectively, where the judge says that, effectively invoking the language of killing, that I think is something that's going to be hard to dislodge, to be honest. Moreover, in paragraph 113, the judge says there are several lawful options and remedies available in our law to deal with racists, including the remedies and procedures provided for in the Equality Act and, if warranted, the criminal law. Now, criminal law didn't seem to work in this case, and of course one would have to again look at the judgment as to why Dante van Wyk was acquitted, but someone who was with him was pled guilty. But yes, there are many avenues available to deal with racists in our society. So effectively, concluding that, and bear in mind, I'm just looking at what the judgment is saying, the judge then finds that, in summary, paragraph 115, the offending statements referred to by Julius Malema set out in the preceding discussion constituted an exhortation to kill white males who had participated in the incident of 9th November 2020, or to respond violently to any other persons who engaged in racist behavior towards the EFF in future. And it held in the following paragraph that both Julius Malema and the EFF should be held jointly liable. We'll explain what that means in a second, because there's no hint of criminal liability here. I've seen it said Julius Malema could go to jail for this. That's not true, based on this judgment. And then finally, it awarded, even though the advocates did this on a pro bono basis, it awarded costs. The respondents shall be liable jointly and severally, so that's the EFF and Julius Malema, for the complainant's costs, which costs shall include fees, traveling costs, and the costs of attendance for the expert witnesses, and the costs of 2 counsel, etc. So the EFF effectively lost this case. Julius Malema lost this case. Couple of things that flow from this. Let me deal with a few of the interesting philosophical questions here. One is, why did or would this judgment consider this hate speech on the grounds of gender as well? Because Malema refers to white men. So it's interesting to me that the judge focused on the racial aspect and not the gender aspect, which is just an interesting philosophical question, because there were also women in the crowd as well. So does the same reasoning that the judge applied to race also apply to gender? And is there a form of discrimination happening on a gender basis? If so, why did the judge not refer to that? Interesting question. There's an interesting question about the EFF versus Julius Malema. Is the EFF responsible here? Is it Malema who's responsible? The EFF has come out and said they disagree with the judgment. It doesn't consider the context of South Africa's history and the EFF's own ideology as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Equality Court is not a place where people go to jail. It's effectively seen as a civil matter. And given the freedom of speech importance in our constitution, in general, it's seen that hate speech cases, even serious hate speech cases under the Equality Act, are not seen as criminal cases. Usually there is civil liability, so in the worst case, damages may be affected, but largely, often apologies, retractions, those kinds of remedies are privileged. As I say, there's the Hate Crimes Act, but that was enacted after this matter even happened. So there's no question of criminal liability here. But, of course, no one wants to be found to have committed hate speech. It's not a good look for anyone or any politician. So the EFF, of course, have said they want to appeal this. Now, interestingly, Julius Malema has been accused of hate speech before. In 2019, in particular, there were a series of hate speech complaints that went to the Human Rights Commission. These were consolidated, scrutinized by the Commission, and the Commission found that they couldn't be called hate speech. So the question of bias on the Human Rights Commission, doesn't really hold, because they've looked at hate speech complaints before and they've dismissed them as it pertains to Julius Malema. Now, that case, by the way, went to court because I think it was AfriForum challenged the Human Rights Commission's decision, and Justice Roland Sutherland actually upheld that and said the Human Rights Commission doesn't have the power. Only a court can decide if something truly is hate speech or not. Now, in parallel to that, the Human Rights Commission went to the Constitutional Court because they are appealing a judgment which says their findings are not fully binding in a separate matter, unrelated. But that appeal, which they launched on the Roland Sutherland judgment, has been held until the Constitutional Court matter on the binding nature of their findings is determined, because it'll affect that appeal. So all of this is to say, if that was a bit convoluted, that there's also a Constitutional Court case now around the powers of the Human Rights Commission and its ability to make final determinations on whether something is hate speech or not. But the relevance for this particular case is that previously the Human Rights Commission has found in favor of Julius Malema. But in this instance, they clearly scrutinized the language and found against him, and are actually the complainants in this matter, which is quite serious, because it's not just Dante van Wyk, it's the Human Rights Commission. But the problem and this I will say, the problem for Julius Malema and the EFF is I think most South Africans detest racism, find the conduct of Dante van Wyk and those Brackenfell students and parents disgusting, reprehensible, we could even say racist, and want them to be dealt with within the parameters of the law, held fully accountable for their actions, which have no place in a democratic South Africa. But when you extend too far and go to the full extreme and then start invoking violence about why killing is appropriate and why revolutionaries must be prepared to kill in the same breath, you grant them a victory. Because now Dante van Wyk, this character who's performed these reprehensible acts, has just been given a political victory in court because of the extreme nature of the language. And the last thing we need in South Africa right now is the Dante van Wyks of this world parading around as victors in courts. But when you give them a victory like this on a silver platter, it doesn't do anything to forward the important struggle for racial justice, which the EFF is often at the forefront of, but then can do counterproductive things like this, which actually take it back. So we must be cautious of a race to the bottom of rhetoric where saying anything, no matter how extreme it is seen as a badge of radical honor, when it can actually just grant racists easy victories in court. Now, Julius Malema has said things which he has apologized for before. I think of the remarks about Kwezi. So he has realized that he's been wrong before and he's moderated his remarks. He's been vindicated on other questions like the Dubuli Bunu song, like the 2019 Human Rights Commission complaints. But this is new territory, because this is a court really saying these remarks amount to hate speech, and it's going to be a very long battle from here. The EFF will probably appeal this to the Supreme Court of Appeal. At the Supreme Court of Appeal, no matter which way things go, it'll probably be appealed to the Constitutional Court. So I think this battle is going to be with us for a long time. There's one final interesting philosophical question, which I do think it's worth examining here, because really, when you boil it down, this is a question about what you are allowed to say in the face of racist violence. And that is an interesting question, because some would argue that when someone is racist, or they perform an act that could be construed as racist violence, they forfeit their right to be spoken to with dignity thereafter. We have a certain idea of self-defense when it comes to, for example, assault or even murder. If your life is threatened, then it's lawful to act in self-defense, even if that means that the person who tried to kill you gets killed. Is there a hate speech self-defense defense? Because that's all I see the EFF being able to rely on, that this person did this terrible thing that could be construed in a racist light. Therefore, our conduct should be seen in that context. But the problem with that is that there would need to be some kind of proportionality assessment. Going and talking about killing, etc., just goes to the absolute extreme of what would be a response. So they would still have to deal with that. And philosophically, I do think that if people do racist things or perform racist acts or commit racist speech, they should be dealt with robustly within the confines of the law in ways that hold them accountable. But I just don't see how that permits one to say anything one wants, even in the face of that violence. But it's tough because South Africa is a really violent place with a really violent history, and there are really violent traumas to which people are responding. So ultimately, there needs to be a balance between freedom of expression and accountability, because you also can't just have a society which says, well, you can say anything you want as long as it's in the face of racism. So there is an interesting philosophical question there about, what are the bounds of hate speech, not in the abstract, but when you have already been a recipient of racism or in the context of a racist act. What is the appropriate way to respond? But be that as it may, those are the philosophical questions. They probably go beyond this particular legal case. The EFF is going to have, let me just say, its work cut out for it in the legal appeal. It's going to carry on for many, many years. But I do think that in the context of the act, unlike many other times when Julius Malema has skirted the boundaries of freedom of expression successfully, this is a case that stands in a slightly different category. But anyway, these are the debates that we need to have as South Africans. We need to consider these questions, and courts are one thing, the public square is another, and we need to debate these matters as a society together so that we can ultimately come to a more just, a more equal, and a more accountable country. So please let me know what you think. Why don't you contribute to the debate down in the comments? Like I say, let's keep this respectful. Obviously, there are passions high on multiple sides of this, but let's continue the comments down below in an era of fruitful engagement. Let me know what you think. Is Julius Malema someone who has now committed hate speech in your view? Do you think that the court has gone too far? Lawyers, I'm interested in your thoughts. What kind of defenses could the EFF mount? Has the court erred? Is the court in fact correct? Has the court set an important precedent? Philosophers, where you at? What is hate speech in the context of an already existing racial act of violence? Fascinating questions that will determine the future of our country, the future of freedom of expression, the limits of freedom of expression, the fortunes of the EFF, the political life of Julius Malema, and indeed of South Africa. Julius Malema is an important politician who I suspect will be around for a long time no matter what happens with this case. But it will always be a point of departure and a talking point for as long as a court, probably the highest court in the land, hasn't yet ruled on it. Like, share, subscribe. By the way, just to say, I carry no can for the EFF. I've been attacked in public by Julius Malema for being an MK podcaster. So I've also been on the receiving end of an EFF attack in public, but I'm more interested in this, particularly in its importance for the law, its intersection, and politics. So it's an interesting case, one we need to keep an eye on. And I look forward to your comments down below. Like, share, subscribe. Help us get to 300,000 subscribers. Keep it locked on SMWX. And see you on the next one. Aye. Following that, I want to look into the judgment, and in particular the reasoning in the judgment. I need to sneeze. I need to sneeze.